Good afternoon to you. Mark Sutter with HurricaneTrack.com here with your Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. Friday, October the 4th, 2019. A little bit of interesting things to talk about today. I'm going to approach this from a different perspective as we look ahead to the rest of the month of October and try to expand your universe of knowledge a little bit and also show you a little bit more of how I track, potential development and things like that. I call it sort of the crowdsourcing of information. You have crowdfunding where multiple people get together with their money and they help make things happen, whatever it is. Well, the same thing is also true with information, whether it's used for political purposes. We've seen how Facebook and Twitter have been used for that. We go back and look at some documentaries that have been made. If you followed the news over the last few years, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Data mining for political purposes, change of governments, whatever, a very powerful and sometimes dangerous tool. But in the world of weather, it could also be very useful to understand how to look at things from a different perspective. So I'll touch upon that a little bit today as well. First, the graphical tropical weather outlook for the Atlantic Basin. Not much happening. This really doesn't have much of a chance, in fact, pretty close to zero, of developing, and a new area has popped up in the subtropics. And we'll keep an eye on these systems to see what happens over the next few days, looking at the satellite animation. As we expand it a little bit more to the west here in the Central Pacific, East Central, a disturbed area that's worth watching, but probably will not amount to much. The continued disturbed weather in the southeastern Pacific. But notice the longitude. It's over here pretty close to 100 degrees west longitude, not tucked away down here closer to Costa Rica and Panama, and that's going to be important going forward. Some disturbed weather not coalescing much in and around the Greater Antilles, southern Gulf of Mexico, but again, nothing really coming together to give anybody any major concerns. Expanding the view out to the eastern Atlantic, this is pretty much shut down this time of year. In terms of development out this way, there's a pretty vigorous tropical wave, certainly some energy there, and that'll try to make its way west over time. And of course, we will watch and see what happens. Another perspective to look at these systems is, of course, the vorticity. And you can see it's just pretty much yellows and greens right now. No reds, like this big powerful storm system up in the North Atlantic. None of that down here in the deep tropics at all. So everything's pretty benign, pretty innocuous. A little bit of concentration of energy south of Bermuda there. Some impulse in the Bahamas, a little bit over Cuba, and a little bit here, straddling the Yucatan. But what's the common theme? Everything is stretched out, strung out. Nothing is bundling up and focusing that energy. And if you don't do that in the tropics, you don't get a tropical cyclone. It's very, very difficult when everything remains spread out and unfocused. All right, so before we go looking at the GFS, I'm going to kind of set the stage here. We've been watching for the possibility of development in the modeling. We know that October has this secondary peak that comes up around the 10th of the month. I probably should have brought the historical, that little chart that shows the peaks. You know how we have the peak usually in September, then it kind of drops off. But then there's this secondary peak that comes back in October around the 10th or so, about a month after the primary peak on the 10th of September. And those peaks are there for a reason, because over time, that is when the most activity has occurred. So early October, we typically don't see that much development. We don't see that much development in October as a whole compared to September, but we do have this time period around the 10th to the 15th of the month that, going back through history, we have seen as the opportunity when something tries to develop. And over the last several years, we have seen that take place. We saw Matthew in 2016. Before that, Joaquin in 2015. 17, we had Nate right in that window. And last year, of course, Michael making landfall right on that date of October the 10th. It fits the pattern perfectly. So that's a very big clue that those are not just random events. They all happen in a part of the basin, generally speaking, over here. And that's the area that we tend to watch. So as I've been talking about, we're looking to see if there is sort of this one last big event for the season, and if so, where will it take place? And climatology suggest that it would be the Western Caribbean, Southwest Atlantic Basin, something like that, maybe the Gulf of Mexico, before we end the month of October. So we look at the operational models. That's what the GFS, the deterministic run is. That's what the Euro is when we look at its deterministic run. Then you have these ensembles. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. So let's just peek at the operational GFS. This is the 850 millibar level. These are those little impulses that I was talking about. You see those here. You know, the trade winds that are coming through the Caribbean out of the Atlantic. That high pressure area over the south is finally getting ready to give way to some cooler weather. And then we're looking to see, you know, do any of these areas bundle up? Any of these existing areas? Are there any new areas? We'll put a question mark down here. It's a sad question mark, but you get the idea. You know what I'm looking for at this point, hopefully. And so if we scroll through the slider, a great tool from Tropical Tidbits, you look and you see, does anything jump out? And you say, well, yeah, it's kind of interesting down there off the coast of South America. There's also, you know, look at that, huge area of energy spread out, and that's what that, just real quick back over here, that's what this yellow circle is all about. That is that. And, you know, that's real spread out energy. It might try to focus. Maybe it gets a name. And, yeah, looks like it bundles up pretty good there. That's about a week out. And that's about as far out as I could really rely on the models being remotely accurate, is 5 to 7 days. My wife asked a very interesting and simple question the other night at dinner. We were talking about this. She was like, well, is there anything coming up in the longer term? And I was like, well, maybe. Some of the modeling beyond 2 weeks, yeah, trying to show something. She's like, yeah, but isn't that pretty unreliable? I said, absolutely. It's pretty much chaos that, you know, one thing leads to another, and you start getting all kinds of wild variations with things. And she said something and asked a very poignant and simple question. Why even have model runs that go out that far if they are never going to verify? And I didn't have an answer, because it is pretty much just chaos when you look beyond 5 to 7 days, especially 10 days and beyond. Now, sometimes you can look and see if there are any patterns that are developing. You know, the model is seeing something far out into time. Let's see if that gets closer in time as we move forward a few days. But it is a very good question that she posed. Why even have the models run that far out in time if they are pretty much never going to verify? Another way to look at it, if the modeling at day 12 and 16 shows a hurricane or a big winter storm in the winter, for example, or a huge ridge of high pressure over a certain area, how many times did that actually verify? Who's keeping track of that? And those are very good questions. So another way to look at this is not just at the deterministic runs, like what we're looking at here, and you say, okay, about a week out, let's back this up. So there it is, exactly 1 week out, 168 hours, GFS suggesting pretty stormy pattern for the areas between Bermuda and the Azores, about a week out. Now, that's a pretty big signal there. And so it's got a pretty good chance of verifying, you know, and there's reasons why the model is showing this. We know that, you know, there's some baroclinic energy from, you know, energy in the atmosphere over here. It's all stretched out over fairly warm water. In other words, it makes sense. These large puzzle pieces come together from our 0 here to our 168 here. It makes sense what happens with the atmosphere. What about what's going on down here? The Western Caribbean, Southwest Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, etc. Why can't we believe that as you scroll out in time that this won't happen? See, it develops tropical cyclones, one in the Pacific, one in the Caribbean, and that is 300 hours out. And you could back it up and go, what about day 10? That's a little bit more believable. That's still pretty far out. And these are very minute weather details here, there's a tropical wave there, that the model is trying to forecast through its physics and numerics 10 days out. You know, and that's a really tough stretch to believe what you see in deterministic forecasting 10 days out. You know, it's sometimes hard to believe something even 5 days out. You remember back to different hurricanes. I mean, just look at Michael, and we're going to do that in just a minute at the end of this. around a year ago. What we knew, we thought we knew, right? 5 days before Michael made landfall, or a week before it made landfall. It's very interesting to look at the deterministic, but it's more helpful to look at ensembles here. And this is where I want to really try to hope to educate you. How do I look at the process of what may happen going forward? How do we sort of clear the smoke to understand what might happen? First of all, what's the point of it? And she asked another question, why do you even burden yourself with looking at those long-range models when more often than not they're not going to come to fruition? And I said, well, it's my job. It's what I do. And I've made a career out of it. It helps me understand. And she's like, you're just rationalizing. You're rationalizing your way out of this rabbit hole that is model watching. All right, so here's another way to try to justify looking at the long-term modeling. So this is Storm 2K. This is the website Storm 2K. It's a message board. Just show you right there. And I've been a member of this since way back. And it's got various members, some of which are professional meteorologists, such as Yakov here. He is from Israel. And there are others. And then there are just folks who are regular, average people who just want to know what the heck's going to happen with tropical weather and other weather as well, as Storm 2K is very famous for. A very, very popular message board dating back to the mid to late 1990s when it was Go PBI and so forth and so on. So what do we have? Well, again, you can look at deterministic, but as Yakov talks about here, the GEFS, if I can say it, it is the ensemble forecast system of the GFS. And so you look at the long term, and you want to know, are there any patterns coming out of this? And what he is noticing is that it's trying to trend away from tropical cyclone formation off the west coast of Central America and more towards formation here in the Western Caribbean. If we look at this animation that he put together, you can see that that's happening. It's very subtle, but it's there. This is earlier, as you can see there, and then to later runs there. And we'll update this and see what he says later. And there are other ensemble packages. The EPS, which he doesn't show here, is also starting to display this. So I'm trying to cut through the noise here. We can look at deterministics. Oh, did you see what this model showed at day 10 or day 12? And understand, well, how do we look through that and see what could really be happening? And so you start looking for evidence. And that's what I was trying to explain to my wife. It's almost like trying to solve a crime before the crime happens. You remember that movie Minority Report with Tom Cruise? You know, the whole pre-crime division in the future, seeing crime before it happens. And Joe Bastardi talks about this. What does he call it? The what before the why, or the why before the what? Whatever. Understanding the weather before it actually happens. And another thing here that Yakov knows to look for, and I call these the keys to the game. Where will the strongest low-level westerly wind burst set up? This sort of change here, this Central American gyre. Where will that energy focus? Will it be in the Western Caribbean, question mark? Or will it be over here in the Eastern Pacific? And these are trackable features. That's the good thing, is we have the tools to watch this. And then there are different people that chime in. And you look at all kinds of meteorology and try to figure it out, and it does become kind of mind-numbing. And then you have these other folks, you know, like this Larry Weather. You know, these are the handles that they have, their usernames on Storm 2K. And you look at the ensemble prediction, these clusterings here. And this is how you approach this. You don't look at a singular run of the modeling, you know, like the GFS here from 12Z, and say, okay, if I scroll it out, doggone it, there we go. Let's see what happens. Okay, hurricane develop. Oh, wow, look at that. No. Don't look at it that way. Try to look at the collective power of numerical weather prediction and what people are saying about it. And that's what I do. I go and I read what these folks are saying. And this is a great place to do that. You know, the Storm 2K message board, Twitter, etc. And you begin to see these patterns. All right, so that's what we look for. And, we go back in time here, and we look out to about day 5. That's where we'll stop. And there's a little bit of evidence down here of energy starting to show up. That's the first clue. That's the one, when you look at a murder investigation, you're looking for evidence. Hairs left at the scene, bullets, whatever, the knife, the smoking gun. This is all beforehand, before the murder took place, so to speak, before the weather that could turn nasty for somebody. Will it be Central America? Will it be Jamaica, the Caymans? How about the Greater Antilles? I don't know. Nobody knows for sure. But this is how you do it, if you want to. Or you could just wait and see, what does the tropical weather outlook, which goes out to 5 days, say, and maybe save a lot of sanity. But when it's your job, like it is for me, Yaakov in Israel, he forecasts the weather. Ben Knoll, others that are out there, Michael Ventris, companies like the Weather Channel, AccuWeather, whoever, the Weather Service, it doesn't matter. We all have a vested interest in wanting to know, and in this case it's tropical cyclones, that one question: what's going to happen in the future? And we don't have definitive answers out beyond 3 to 5 days that are really, really helpful. And so beyond that time frame, we have to be careful that we understand what we are looking at. And that brings me to my point here about Michael. And this is perfect, how this fits in with going and looking at the 1-year anniversary as we approach that next week. A year ago, and let me again re-emphasize in case somebody takes this out of context, this is the archive. We're going back in time. There is no Leslie out there, right? So this is going back and looking at the setup 1 year ago, October 4th, 2018. Make that very, very clear. So, a very similar type setup. You remember early on, there was talk about this Central American gyre setting up in this area. By the way, what is that, you may ask, a Central American gyre? The best way to describe it, instead of just trade winds coming across from east to west, straight across the Atlantic through the Caribbean and into the eastern Pacific, once in a while you get this wind shift, this sort of monsoonal change, this gyre. Gyre is like a large turning. And in this case, it's generally cyclonic. And you get this westerly wind component that comes in, and it focuses sometime and leaks into the Caribbean. So you have anomalous westerly wind. And I say anomalous because remember, usually the wind is coming across like this at all these different zones of the atmosphere. Pretty much straight across trade winds. But once in a while, for reasons that are not always known, you get this setup where you have this anomalous flow coming in from the west this way, but you also still have that easterly flow coming this way, and you start to bend it and develop this cyclonic gyre. Huge turning, and then you get these pieces of energy that come off of Colombia. Sometimes there's a tropical wave that enters the picture, and a piece of that energy will pinch off and develop into a tropical cyclone. It's very complex, but that's the easiest way for me to describe it. And sometimes that'll happen over here. In fact, more often than not, that's where it does happen. But sometimes it'll happen over here. And in the later part of the hurricane season, that's why we look to the Northwest Caribbean, the Western Caribbean, whatever, because over time, Hurricane Michelle, 2001, late season. Mitch, 1998, late season, Western Caribbean. Wilma, 2005. I could go on and on and on. And the most recent example is Michael. 1 year ago, this is what we were looking at. There you go. That's what it was. A broad low pressure area. Do you remember this? Let's see if I click on this, if it shows the satellite picture. Does it? Let's see if it has it. Yes! Beautiful. It did. That's the 2-day. Let's see if the... Well, no, there won't be a satellite picture for 5 days. Sorry, I'm trying to remember what all this showed. So the 2-day outlook, this would date back to the 4th, but going forward 5 days, that's what they were looking at on that one I showed you. Anyway, here's the weather. I got lost, sorry. That's a classic example of what I'm talking about. So that was the 2-day satellite graphical combined, and then the 5-day, this is what it looked like for Michael. And you remember how this all turned out. So that was 5 days, and that led us up to If that was the 4th, 5 days later would be the 9th. And on the 9th, Category 4, Michael was located there, and it made landfall on the 10th as a Cat 5. Interesting, isn't it? We all thought we knew, and I remember reading the message boards last year, and different people that work in professional capacities were saying, oh, more likely a sheared, east-weighted, meaning all the weather's on the east side, typical late-season mess for the northern Gulf Coast. That were some people's official forecast who do forecasting out beyond 5 days. That was not the official from the National Hurricane Center, not yet. That forecast, I think, was issued on the 6th or something like that, and it did call for a 70-mile-per-hour tropical storm near Mexico Beach. We saw how that turned out. What I'm getting at, even 5 to 7 days out, you have no clue sometimes as to what's going to happen. Other times it's a lot more straightforward. Irma was a great example of an easy forecast for a very strong hurricane. Andrew, once it got going in 1992, way back then, was a fairly easy forecast once those puzzle pieces were in place. But sometimes those puzzle pieces, you think they fit, and you go, doggone it, they don't. And that's where you have to understand what you're looking at and how all those pieces fit. All right, so hopefully I taught you something today about how I do my process, how I look at things, how you should approach things, and in the end, if something develops, we'll be on top of it, and we'll see where it goes and how strong it'll be when it gets there. But until then, the modeling is simply just guidance for the future, and just like trying to predict how well your football or your basketball team's going to do in the preseason, or even the day before, they have game day from ESPN, and they got all these keys to the game. Unexpected things happen, and you never know what the results are going to be. Sports and weather have more correlations than you could possibly know. It's true. Hey, maybe that's why some of the big sports colleges like Mississippi State or University of Wisconsin or Penn State and others have such good sports programs and meteorology programs. They go hand in hand sometimes. All right, so we'll keep an eye on what's happening, and I'll talk about it with you. For next week, as I ended here with Michael, the 1-year anniversary, I'm going to be going back to Mexico Beach, and on Monday, I will officially announce where we're going to have this get-together. I just want to make sure that everything is lined up before we start, here's what we're going to do. Everybody come see it. I am going to show the Michael chapter, if you will, from our documentary on Mexico Beach at a restaurant. We're still making sure 100% that it's a go, and that'll be Wednesday evening, probably around 7:30. I know that the town of Mexico Beach is going to be doing some stuff between 5 and 7, and I'm going to talk about this more on Monday. It's important to reflect on the past, as I talked about. I know a lot of people would rather not relive it, but it's not about reliving the pain. It's more about accepting we live where hurricanes hit, and we have to move on. We have to rebuild. It is difficult. I empathize with that. But ignoring it doesn't make it go away. We know that. And so we don't celebrate it, but we remember for a reason. And in my case, it's to go back and look at what we accomplished from the scientific perspective, and also how people have adapted and changed, and the hardships they're still going through in Mexico Beach and elsewhere in the Florida Panhandle, Southwest Georgia, Southeast Alabama. Michael will be a part of the history down there for generations to come, and that all began about a year ago. So we will reflect on that some more as we get into early next week. All right? Have a great weekend out there. Enjoy the cool down in the east. It's much deserved. I like summer, but I'll take it. At least it'll make my electric bill a little bit lower, hopefully. Have a great weekend. Thanks, as always, for tuning in from your side of things. I really appreciate you being there. As I say, I hope you learned something. If not, well, I'll try harder. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you some more over the weekend.